Right now, today, Monday, it's quiet. Dry even across most of the mid-Atlantic and New England. If you stepped outside this afternoon, you'd have no real reason to think anything was wrong. That's exactly the problem. Because 48 hours from now, the National Weather Service's own Weather Prediction Center is telling us this entire calm stretch, from Virginia up through New York and into New England, is about to get replaced by a multi-day stretch of repeated, potentially dangerous flash flooding, and it's landing on ground that's already been hammered by flooding rain more times than I can casually list this summer. I need you to actually sit with that setup for a second, because the calm before the storm isn't just a cliche here. It's the literal forecast. Sunday, today, stays dry. Monday, an advancing cold front starts the transition. Tuesday, the Weather Prediction Center has already placed New York and the mid-Atlantic under a slight risk of excessive rainfall, with the I-95 corridor from Virginia through the New York City region sitting inside a zone for severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, hail, and flash flooding. And Wednesday, an intensifying area of low pressure takes that same threat and pushes it directly into New England with a dynamic coastal system forecast to take shape right along the New England coastline through Thursday. So today we're going to break this down properly, why the system is forming the way it is, why the ground underneath it is already primed for trouble after a summer that's already produced multiple significant flood events across this exact corridor, the specific day-by-day timeline through the middle of this week, and what actually makes this kind of setup dangerous in a way that a simple "rain is coming" headline doesn't capture. Let's get into it. Before we get into this week's system specifically, you need to understand something important. This isn't rain falling on dry, thirsty ground that will happily soak it up. This is rain arriving on top of a mid-Atlantic and northeast corridor that has already been repeatedly hit by heavy rainfall and flash flooding multiple times this July alone. Go back to the 4th of July holiday weekend. Severe thunderstorms slammed the northeast and mid-Atlantic, with rainfall rates exceeding 2 inches an hour in spots, widespread totals of 3 to 6 inches, and localized amounts surpassing 8 inches in isolated locations. Roofs failed under the weight of water. A section of roof collapsed at a BJ's wholesale club in Ocean Township, New Jersey during that event. Streets flooded across towns like Deal, New Jersey. More than 750,000 people across the country lost power in the aftermath, with Michigan and Pennsylvania each logging over 130,000 outages on their own. Then, just days later, on July 7th, another significant system moved through, with the Weather Prediction Center issuing a level 3 out of 4 flash flood risk for New York City, Long Island, and the coastal areas of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and southeastern Massachusetts, plus a broader level 2 out of 4 risk stretching from central Massachusetts through New York's lower Hudson Valley, New Jersey, the Delmarva Peninsula, and into western Pennsylvania. That system explicitly followed what forecasters described as a weekend of severe storms that had already saturated the soil, creating what they called ideal conditions for flash flooding. A pattern you're about to hear me describe again for this week's system. It kept going. On July 18th, another round of severe storms and flash flooding hit a corridor stretching from northeastern Kentucky to New Jersey, including Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia, under a level 3 out of 5 risk. And just this past week, on July 22nd, flash flooding and severe storms targeted the mid-Atlantic and southeast, putting cities like Richmond, Virginia Beach, Raleigh, and Charlotte under flash flood risk. I'm walking you through that entire sequence because it matters directly to what happens this week. Rivers across this region have had limited time to fully recede between events. Soil moisture in a lot of these watersheds is already elevated. Urban drainage systems, especially in older cities along this corridor, have been repeatedly stressed without much recovery time in between. When you add a new multi-day heavy rain event on top of ground that's already this saturated, the same rainfall total produces meaningfully more runoff, faster rises on smaller streams, and a higher flash flood risk than the identical storm would produce hitting dry ground. There's also a compounding infrastructure angle worth understanding here. Repeated heavy rain events don't just saturate soil, they place cumulative stress on the same physical systems over and over without a real recovery window. Storm sewers that handled the July 4th event adequately can still be carrying debris, silt, or minor damage from that storm when the next one arrives less than 2 weeks later. Utility crews working through outage restoration from one event sometimes haven't fully completed repairs before the next round of severe weather hits the same territory. None of that shows up cleanly on a rainfall forecast map, but it's part of why emergency managers and meteorologists in this region have been using increasingly urgent language about this pattern as July has worn on. It's not just about how much rain any single storm drops, it's about how many storms have already hit the exact same infrastructure in the exact same month. Here's the actual meteorological engine behind this week's threat, straight from the Weather Prediction Center's own forecast discussion issued this Sunday afternoon. An advancing cold front and a strengthening area of low pressure are set to bring rounds of showers and thunderstorms starting Monday, continuing into the middle of the week. What makes this system worth tracking closely, rather than just filing under typical summer rain, is the specific moisture setup involved. Forecasters are describing strengthening east to south low-level wind flow drawing in moisture-rich air directly off the Atlantic, with precipitable water values. Essentially, a measurement of how much total moisture is packed into a column of the atmosphere above a given location, from the ground up through the upper atmosphere, reaching around 75 inches. That's a genuinely saturated atmosphere on the higher end for what this region typically sees. Forecasters are also referencing something called a trowel, short for trough of warm air aloft, pivoting around what's being described as a slow-moving comma head. The classic comma-shaped moisture and cloud pattern you'll sometimes see wrapping around a strengthening low-pressure system on satellite imagery, named because it genuinely looks like a giant comma from space. When a system develops that kind of comma head structure and then moves slowly rather than pushing through quickly, it tends to park heavy rain bands over the same locations for extended periods instead of letting them pass through and move on. That combination, a moisture-rich atmosphere, a slow-moving low, and a warm air trough wrapping precipitation around it, is exactly the recipe for the kind of training thunderstorms that produce dangerous flash flooding, where one storm after another moves over the same exact spot, like train cars running on the same track. Forecasters have also specifically noted that this system may linger longer than earlier forecast runs had suggested, with the heavy rain threat now expected to persist from Monday's onset through at least Thursday in parts of eastern New England as the system slowly pulls offshore. Let's map this out day by day, because I want you tracking this with an actual mental calendar instead of a vague sense that it's going to rain this week. Today, Sunday, July the 26th, largely dry across the bulk of the mid-Atlantic and northeast. This is genuinely your prep window. Use it. Monday, July 27th, the advancing cold front begins pushing showers and thunderstorms into the region. This is when the pattern starts to actively build, setting the stage for the more serious threat arriving the following day. The Weather Prediction Center's broader short-range outlook, valid from Monday evening through Wednesday morning, specifically flags the risk for severe thunderstorms and flash flooding spreading from the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes and Northeast over exactly this window. Tuesday, July 28th. This is the day I want you paying the closest attention to across the mid-Atlantic and into New York. The Weather Prediction Center has placed portions of New York and the mid-Atlantic under a slight risk of excessive rainfall specifically for Tuesday. The I-95 corridor, running from Virginia through the New York City metro area, sits inside the zone flagged for potential severe thunderstorms, meaning damaging wind gusts and hail are realistic possibilities alongside the flooding threat, not separate concerns. Forecasters are specifically warning about repeated downpours capable of producing localized urban and flash flooding, with the greatest concern in low-lying areas and locations with poor drainage. Exactly the kind of terrain that's had the least time to recover after this summer's earlier events. Wednesday, July 29th, the threat shifts and intensifies further north and east. An intensifying area of low pressure is forecast to bring numerous showers and thunderstorms stretching from upstate New York into New England. Southern New England, specifically, is looking at 1 to 2 inches of rainfall, with locally higher amounts possible depending on exactly where the heaviest bands set up and how long they linger over any one location. This is also the day the Weather Prediction Center's own day 4 and 5 outlook flags a slight risk of excessive rainfall specifically for portions of the Northeast, tied to what they're describing as a dynamic coastal system, taking shape along or near the New England coastline between Tuesday and Thursday. Thursday, July 30th. Rain may persist across eastern New England as the broader low-pressure system slowly moves offshore. The good news, according to the Weather Prediction Center's own forecast language, is that once this system does pull away, the pattern should return to something closer to typical for early August, with a more standard easterly trade wind flow reasserting itself along the coast. I want to spend a minute on something genuinely important here because I don't want to give you a false sense of precision about exactly where the worst flooding will land. Flash flooding is one of the hardest weather hazards to pin down to an exact location days in advance, and it's not because forecasters lack skill, it's because of how the physics actually works. A broad area can be under a legitimate flash flood risk, meaning the ingredients are all present across a wide region, while the actual worst flooding ends up concentrated in a narrow band only a few miles wide, determined by exactly where the heaviest, slowest moving thunderstorm cells happen to set up and repeatedly train over the same drainage. That's part of why you'll see phrases like slight risk covering a huge swath of the map. It's describing the probability that somewhere within that zone sees flash flooding, not a guarantee that every single town inside the outlined area gets hit equally hard. This is also why local drainage conditions matter as much as the rainfall total itself. A 3-inch rainfall total spread evenly over 12 hours is a completely different hazard than the same 3 inches falling in 90 minutes directly over a small urban watershed with limited storm drain capacity. Meteorologists track something called flash flood guidance specifically for this reason, an estimate of roughly how much rain, over how many hours, a given small stream or urban drainage area can handle before it starts to flood. In this week's forecast discussion, meteorologists specifically referenced flash flood guidance thresholds as low as roughly 1, 5 inches over 3 hours in some of the more vulnerable corridors, which tells you just how little margin some of these drainage systems have left after this summer's repeated hits. It's worth understanding why that threshold keeps dropping as a season like this one goes on. Flash flood guidance isn't a fixed number, tied only to a watershed's physical size and drainage infrastructure. It's dynamically recalculated based on current soil saturation and recent rainfall history. Ground that's already holding significant moisture from the last storm simply can't absorb the next round of rain the way it could earlier in a drier summer. So the same watershed that could handle 3 inches in 3 hours back in early June might only be able to safely absorb half that amount today. That's the actual mechanism behind the phrase you'll hear meteorologists use constantly this time of year. Saturated ground isn't just a description, it's a specific, quantifiable reduction in how much additional rain a given area can take before flooding starts. And it's precisely why this week's system is being watched more closely than an equivalent rainfall total would have been watched back in May. I want to give you one piece of relevant history here, not to cause alarm, but because it's genuinely useful context for understanding why forecasters are watching this pattern closely. Back in July of 2023, a remarkably similar setup produced one of the most destructive flooding events the Northeast has seen in recent memory. High dew points and precipitable water values ranging from roughly 1, 6 to 1, 8 inches, combined with slow-moving convection to devastate Vermont specifically, with Montpellier's downtown flooding and more than 34 homes destroyed statewide. The Weather Prediction Center issued its first ever high-risk excessive rainfall outlook for that event, the highest tier on their scale, for the area covered by the National Weather Service office in Burlington, Vermont. Rainfall across the broader region reached as high as 49 inches in Putnam Valley, New York, and Vermont's governor at the time called the flooding historic and catastrophic. I want to be precise about why I'm bringing this up. This week's forecast currently sits at a slight risk level, not the high risk level that preceded the 2023 Vermont disaster, and the precipitable water values forecast for this week, around 1. 75 inches sit within a similar range to that event, but aren't automatically destined to produce the same outcome. Slow-moving, moisture-rich systems like this one don't always produce catastrophic results. Most of the time, they produce serious but manageable flooding that closes some roads and causes localized damage without headline-level destruction. But the atmospheric ingredients driving this week's system, high precipitable water, combined with a slow-moving low that's expected to linger for days rather than push through quickly, are genuinely the same category of ingredients that produced 2023's disaster. That's worth knowing, and it's exactly the kind of thing I'll be watching for as this week actually unfolds, rather than assuming either outcome in advance. If you live anywhere along this corridor, from Virginia up through the mid-Atlantic and into New England, here's what I actually want you to do with the next 24 to 48 hours before this system fully arrives. First, use today, while it's still dry, to actually check your specific flood risk. If you live near a small stream, in a basement apartment, in a low-lying neighborhood, or in an area that's flooded before, even in a relatively minor event, treat that history as a genuine predictor rather than something you got past last time through luck. Second, plan your Tuesday and Wednesday commutes with real flexibility built in. If you drive through any low-lying underpass, any road that's flooded before, or any area with a history of poor drainage, have a genuine alternate route in mind, and be willing to actually use it rather than pushing through standing water because you're already running late. Turn around, don't drown isn't a slogan I'm going to skip past here. A shockingly large share of flood deaths in this country happen inside vehicles that drove into water the driver assumed was shallow. Third, if you're anywhere in the specific zones flagged for Tuesday's severe thunderstorm risk along the I-95 corridor, treat the damaging wind and hail threat as seriously as the flooding threat. Secure any loose outdoor items, know where you'd shelter if a severe thunderstorm warning is issued specifically for damaging winds, and don't assume that because the headline says flooding, wind damage isn't also a real possibility that same day. Fourth, if you're in southern New England specifically, watch the Wednesday and Thursday timeline closely, since that's when the system is forecast to intensify and take on that dynamic coastal structure right along your coastline. Given how this system has already been described as potentially lingering longer than earlier model runs suggested, don't assume it clears out immediately once Wednesday's rain arrives. Build some flexibility into your plans through Thursday as well. And fifth, sign up for actual flash flood warnings on your phone, not just the general severe weather alerts. Flash flood warnings are typically issued with far shorter lead time than a flood watch, sometimes just minutes before water starts rising in a specific creek or urban drainage area, which means the alert itself is often your only real warning window. One more practical note specific to this week. If you have a basement that's flooded before, or you know your sump pump has struggled in past heavy rain, test it today while conditions are still dry rather than discovering a problem for the first time on Tuesday night. The same goes for checking that any window wells, French drains, or exterior grading around your home are actually clear of debris. These are exactly the kind of small, unglamorous tasks that make the difference between a stressful but manageable heavy rain event and genuine property damage. And today is the only day this week you'll have to do them without rain already falling. Here's what I'll personally be tracking as the system develops over the next several days. I'm watching whether the Weather Prediction Center upgrades any portion of this outlook from a slight risk to a moderate or high risk as we get closer to Tuesday and Wednesday, since that kind of upgrade would be a genuine signal that confidence in a more serious, potentially historic level event has increased, similar to what happened in the days leading up to the 2023 Vermont flooding. I'm watching exactly where the heaviest, slowest moving storm cells actually set up on Tuesday, since that narrow band, more than the broad outlined risk area, is what will determine which specific communities see the worst impacts. And I'm watching how the system behaves once it reaches New England Wednesday into Thursday, specifically whether that dynamic coastal system description holds and produces the kind of extended, lingering rainfall that's historically been the most dangerous pattern for this region, rather than a faster moving system that dumps rain and clears out. So here's where this stands as of today, Sunday, July 26th. A multi-day flooding threat is set to build across the mid-Atlantic and New England starting Monday, driven by an advancing cold front and a strengthening, slow-moving area of low pressure tapping into a genuinely moisture-rich atmosphere. Tuesday brings the sharpest risk to the I-95 corridor from Virginia through New York City, with severe thunderstorms, flash flooding, damaging winds, and hail all in play. Wednesday shifts that threat north and east into New England as the system intensifies along the coast, with the heavy rain potentially lingering into Thursday before finally clearing. And all of this is landing on a corridor that's already absorbed multiple significant flooding events this July alone, meaning the ground has less capacity to handle what's coming than it would in a normal, less saturated summer. I'll be tracking the system daily as it develops, and I'll bring you the update the moment the Weather Prediction Center's risk levels shift in either direction. This is exactly the kind of setup that deserves your attention now, while it's still calm outside, rather than Tuesday afternoon once the first flash flood warning is already flashing on your phone. If breakdowns like this help you actually prepare instead of just react, subscribe, because I'll have the next update as soon as this pattern moves. I'll see you in the next one.